Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with John Wick, the creative director of 7th Sea, and we talked about failure in tabletop role-playing games. The dice don't always fall in your favor, and John talks about how when things go wrong, it can often improve a story and not be a bad thing. I'll jump over to the interview in just a moment, but first, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. Thanks for watching.
Well, often it's not. And it's because the system teaches you that it's not. I like using the Miyagi rule, the Mr. Miyagi rule, which is from Karate Kid. And he says, there's no such thing as a bad student, just a bad teacher. And I say, there's no such thing as a bad player, just a bad game. The game tells the player how to play, and the player does that because the game rewards them for it. And in a lot of role-playing games, games punish failure. And so you want to avoid it. That's why you have so many game systems that have, in many cases, redundant systems that prevent the player from failing. And rather than and what I did when I started building a game called Houses of the Blooded, which is a game about tragedy. I want you to play Elric and Hamlet and characters who have doom like hanging over them. You know that they have a bad ending waiting for them. And I was thinking, okay, how do you do that? How do you reward players for failure, for for screwing up? And the best way to do that is just do it. Have the game reward players when they fail. In Houses of the Blooded, you get essentially bennies, cool points, hero points, force points, whatever you want to call them, whenever you don't roll dice and just say, no, my character fails. And then that was how Houses of the Blooded did it. And then when I started running D&D for various groups, because they wanted to play D&D, I told them, if you fail this role, this important role, I will give you inspiration. Because what inspires you more than failure, right? So and it always came from me, from the GM. It wasn't player initiated, it was GM initiated, and that I will give you inspiration if you fail this role. So that way a player can't go, oh, well, I'm going to do this insignificant thing, and oh, I fail, oops, I get inspiration, right? But I also rewarded players when a big role, important role did come up, and they would say, hey, if I fail this, can I get inspiration? And I was like, absolutely. And so from that point of view, failure becomes fun because, number one, it's in the player's hands. They have a voice in how their character fails and when they fail. And then as a GM, I don't like pound a nail through their skull. Oh, you failed. Ha ha ha. Let's kick you and you're down. I turn it into an opportunity to make things harder for the rest of the players. Failure doesn't necessarily mean the end. It means complication. Things are more complicated now. And that's how I think you can make failure fun in a role-playing game.
So flowing on from that, you've talked a little bit about how you can reward failure mechanically, but from a storytelling perspective, why is it good to include failure in a narrative? How does it make things more complicated in an exciting way?
Well, despite the fact that Aristotle got almost everything wrong, one of the things that he got right was the idea that ending in his book Poetics, he talks about how endings should be inevitable but surprising. In other words, you give the players what they want, but you give it to them in a way they didn't expect. And so failure sets that up. It's failure is a really good way of setting up something that a player wants, but in a way they don't expect it. And I think one of the really, really good examples of using this, and it's something I think every GM should watch, is the Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul TV shows, which handle mistakes in beautiful, elegant ways. Because the players have made a mistake, now they have to improvise and deal with the error. They have to deal with the error before it compounds and gets bigger. A really good example is, without giving away too many spoilers or things, but in the show, Walt and Jesse, the two main characters, the chemistry teacher and the student who are making meth for reasons, are in a fight in their camper that they're making meth in, when the cops show up, and they're in the meth lab with the cops outside, and they have the door locked, and it resulted in a mistake. It resulted in an oversight that they made, and so now there's cops outside, and now they're inside the meth lab. They don't know, and the cops don't know who's in there, but they know somebody's in there, and they have to find a way to get rid of the cops, to get out of there. And the way they do it is ingenious, but with no spoilers. But again, setting up things like that, setting up things that where players say, you know what, I overlooked this detail. And you, because you're a GM who has trained yourself how stories work, you go, okay, if they've overlooked that detail, that means if this, then that. If A, then B. So B shows up. And now they have to deal. They were just dealing with A, but now they're dealing with A and B. And now they have to figure out how to deal with both of those things.
So if you're a newish player or a newish GM and you are wanting to involve more failure in your games, you're trying to make those elements more exciting, how do you balance all of the different factors? How do you not stray into being like an overly punishing GM? Or how do you avoid being a player who is, not going to achieve the objectives that the game is sort of setting out for you?
I think viewing the GM as someone who punishes you for like oversights is baggage from like way back in the day. I prefer to look at myself as a GM as someone who is on the player's side, but is at the same time, I am an antagonist in that I am, in a literary sense, the antagonist is the character who shows up and causes change. Right. I like to illustrate the movie that everybody's seen, which is The Shawshank Redemption. I ask people, who is the protagonist in that movie? And people point at Tim Robbins' character and said, he's the protagonist. And I was like, no, he's the antagonist. He shows up in the prison and causes things to change. And he causes Red, Morgan Freeman's character, to accept hope. Right? He's the antagonist. He shows up and causes change. So there's, that's that kind of thing. And that's my job as a GM. My job is if I wasn't here, the players would be in the tavern, drinking mead and having a good time. And I'm the person who has the farmer show up and say, there's trolls eating our cattle. That's my job as an antagonist, not necessarily as the bully who's like, I can do anything because I'm the GM. Sure, you can. There's nothing stopping you. Rock falls, you all die is a valid GM move. You'd never play with that GM again, but it's a valid move. But rather seeing yourself as someone who introduces things for the players to overcome. And one of the big GM tropes that I'm a big fan of is that you are a fan of the player characters. So I'm a fan of those characters. I'm on my couch with popcorn watching their TV show, and I'm hoping they make it, but that doesn't always happen. And that's how I see the GM's job.
What about when you move failure into a much more serious level? What about when you have a entire scenario or even a campaign that ends in a fail state? Is that just like a larger version of the same principles?
I think so. I have a rule that I use, I wrote in my Play Dirty book, which is called the dire peril rule, which I used just the other night in my D&D game. And dire peril, a friend of mine, Chris, made a beer coaster, which has dire peril on one side and a smiley face on the other. And so he has the smiley face on his thing. And the dire peril rule is, if I invoke it, I am rolling all of my dice in front of the screen. I really don't use the screen anyway, but I roll all my dice in front of the players. I'm not fudging anything. And if the dice kill your character, the dice kill your character. And that's dire peril. And so my buddy Chris has a beer coaster that has the smiley face and then dire peril on the other side. And without saying a word, he'll be like, so you walk into this cave, and this shadowy figure approaches you, and he's wearing a sword, and he just very quietly flips the dire peril beer thing up. So now dire peril is up. And the players know, if you engage with this person in a violent way, it's going to be bad.
How do you think that the character a player has made feeds into the way that they fail, like the flaws that they've built up over time, things like that?
So a lot of role-playing games have flaws built into them, that their character, you take a 2-point flaw, right, or a 4-point flaw. That is the player, like everything else on the character sheet. That is the player telling you, the GM, I want this to be part of the story. And again, you give the player what they want in a way they don't expect. So when they put flaws on their character sheet, they are giving you permission to do what Apocalypse World likes to call a hard move, which is, I am going to put you in a place. I'm going to put you in a corner, and you have to decide what you're going to do. And you've said that's okay under this circumstance. Now, if suddenly you're like, wait a minute, I really didn't think this through. And, I'm like, okay, take that off your character sheet then, because clearly you don't want this to be part of your character. Right. But, you're going to have to, it depends on how you want to handle. Every player is different. Every GM is different. You could say, okay, let's whitewash that scene, take that off your character sheet. We'll deal with it later. Or you can say, it was on your character sheet. You have to deal with it now, but then you never have to deal with it again. So each player is different, and you have to like find people's level, right? You have to find people's level and figure out, where they're cool, and then go from there.
I want to talk about the flip side of failure for a second. I want to talk about success in a balance in all things kind of way. How should you be playing successes or altering the successes that you give your players to make their failures more impactful?
I think that failure sets up for bigger victories. One of the models I use for being a GM is the movie Die Hard. And I make an argument, and I think it's true, that every player wants to be John McClane at the end of Die Hard. Every player wants to be, you've got a gun that has 2 bullets. There's 2 bad guys that are holding your wife hostage. You have glass in your feet. You've been shot. You've been stabbed. You've been burned. You've been fallen out of a window. And how are you going to deal with this situation? I think every player wants to be in that spot. And so the only way to be in that spot is where you do get shot and you do get the glass in your feet and you mess up and Hans figures out that your wife is, that you and Holly are married, and all of these failures build up to the climactic scene where you win, where you overcome all the odds. And the only reason you can overcome odds is because of the failures that preceded it. Another really good example is Jared Sorensen likes to bring up Ghostbusters. If you watch Ghostbusters as a role-playing game, they fail every roll. They fail every roll until the very end, when they do the one thing they're not supposed to do. When the players go, there's a giant marshmallow man walking through the city, and the players are like, what happens if we cross the streams? And the Egon player makes a roll, and he goes, I don't know. And they go, well, there's only one way to find out. And as a GM, you are obliged at that moment to follow the GM rule of say yes or roll dice. And either way, if the Ghostbusters GM said yes, then it just works, because he's so like, oh, you're gonna, that's, let's do it, right? On the other hand, he went, okay, roll dice, and they rolled really, really well and succeeded.
So there's been a lot of great info here. Do you have any final thoughts on the topic of failure more broadly?
Most role-playing games tell the players and the GM that a game should be played as success, 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 success. I just can't even say the word subsequently. So yes, success after success. That's not true. It's not how drama works. It's not how stories work. Stories go through arcs, go through valleys and mountaintops, right? And the only way, if you want to tell a great story, failure is necessary. It's philosophically necessary. Otherwise, you're just playing a Mary Sue character who gets what they want all the time. And if you want to play that story, that's great. More power to you if that's what makes you happy. But I think it is more emotionally satisfying when we see it is just as emotionally satisfying seeing our heroes succeed as when they overcome their failures.